Okay, this is our last set of notes for this semester. We're actually just finishing up some things that we didn't cover in the last set of notes. Your handout, which you should have picked up when you came in, is going to be filled in as you go through these notes, but you'll notice you have a different title. It says 26-1, Introduction to the Animal Kingdom. That's just the name of the chapter in the textbook, but please use this title when you put it into your lecture notebook, and also make sure to use this title when you add this to the first page of this unit so that you can get it stamped. Okay. This handout is for you to fill in as you go. There are also diagrams that have missing labels, so make sure that you fill in those labels. And there are some things that I talk about in audio, like some examples and stuff like that, some clarification. This is a little bit complicated, this section here. We talk about things like embryology and stuff. So if you find like something doesn't make sense, really don't hesitate to pause and raise your hand and I can clarify something, or you can jot down a question and I can come back to it later. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So, as we go through the animal kingdom in our zoology semester, which we're technically going to officially start in January, we're going to start by looking at simpler organisms, simpler animals more towards the beginning of the semester. And then as we go through the semester, we're going to get through more and more complex animals. Okay, and so if we were to look at these animals in a phylogenetic tree or an evolutionary tree, kind of like a cladogram that we learned about earlier this semester, and there is actually one of those in the textbook on page 660. All of the organisms tend to go from more simple towards the left of the evolutionary tree, so like earlier on, and then as we go towards the right, you'll find organisms get more complicated, and then organisms such as chordates or vertebrates like us are more towards the right hand side. Okay, so there's this trend of going from more simple to more complex, and there are actually 4 specific trends that we see in animal evolution that kind of distinguish simpler animals from more complicated ones. So here are those 4 trends, and these are actually the 4 that we're going to talk about in these notes. So complex animals tend to have higher levels of cell specialization and internal body organization. And by the way, we're going to explain what each of these are, so if it's like, whoa, you're throwing a lot of terms at me, don't worry, it'll make sense as we go through. So that's 1. 2 is bilateral body symmetry. 3 is a front end or head with sense organs. And then lastly, 4 is the complex animals tend to have some kind of body cavity. Okay, so we'll go through these in order, and we'll start actually with this first one here, cell specialization. Okay, so as animals have evolved over time, like by natural selection and other evolutionary processes, cells tend to get more specialized. So what that means is they start to become, as we go towards more complex animals, we start to see cells having very specific jobs. So like customized cells. If you look at earlier animals, their cells, they don't have as much of a diversity or variety of cells. Kind of like one size fits all kind of cells that do a lot of the life functions of the animal, and there's really just a few different types. And then as you get to more complex organisms, you start seeing more like cells that only have one specific job. Like you have nervous cells or muscle cells, or the kind of cells that would be found in a lung or a kidney or so on. Okay, and that's partly because larger animals, which are more complex animals, because they're so large and there's a lot of stuff going on inside of them to maintain homeostasis, they need to have a more efficient body system. And in order to be more efficient, their cells have to have specific roles, specific jobs that when they all do their thing make that organism more efficient. Okay, and so in larger animals, we start to see what we call levels of organization. And we have talked about these before, or you've definitely seen them at least in biology, but the general kind of flow chart that you probably would have seen is something like this. Okay, so usually you have cells that, these are the basic structural unit of a living organism, in this case an animal, and you have cells that are going to be very specific in terms of their job. So maybe you have a group of cells that are smooth muscle tissue that go into the wall of, let's say, the stomach. Okay, so cells that do the same function, a group of cells that do the same function, actually fall under the next level of organization, which is called tissue. So that would be like a smooth muscle tissue in the wall of a stomach. Okay, is made up of smooth muscle cells. And then if you have groups of tissues that work together to do a specific job, then you have an organ. So for example, the different types of tissues that are found in the wall of a stomach, not just the smooth muscle tissue, but other tissues as well, connective tissue and so on, then you have the next level, which would be an organ, like a stomach is an organ. If you have several organs that work together to do a particular function within the body, so are like cooperative with each other, then you have an organ system. So for example, the stomach plus the intestines plus the esophagus and so on, that's all part of the digestive organ system. And then if you have several organ systems that are all working together to keep homeostasis in an organ, in an individual, then you have an organism. Like an organism has a digestive system, a reproductive system, respiratory system, and so on. These are all different organ systems. Okay, so this is the level of organization. Hopefully you remember that from biology. Okay, now this whole specialization of cells, we can actually see evidence of this in the developmental stages of animals, like even as early as as soon as a sperm cell and an egg cell come together in fertilization. Okay, so we're gonna kind of take a short detour here and talk a little bit about that. Okay, so remember, animals reproduce sexually, and so you have a sperm cell and an egg cell. When they come together, they form a zygote, okay, or fertilized egg, like you see here. Okay, now as soon as this egg is fertilized, immediately after it starts to divide, and so the first division is one that takes that cell and divides it into two. Then these two will divide into four, they'll divide this way and keep dividing and dividing, and then eventually, after a series of divisions, the zygote ends up being a bunch of cells, and this is called a blastula. And in fact, it's not like a solid ball, but more like a hollow ball of cells. Like you can see here, this is a cross section. I mean, it technically, this is all usually covered up, but this is just cut so that you can see inside of it. Okay, so this is what we call a blastula. Now, eventually, there's an opening that forms. Once this blastula is made, then an opening forms in the wall of the blastula, and that's called a blastopore. I think we have it labeled, on another slide here. Okay, so that opening forms, and imagine it like a little pore or opening in the wall here. Let's say it's right here. Okay, so that blastopore is then going to turn into one of a couple possible options depending on the type of animal that we're dealing with. Okay, so here's the blastopore. Okay, and so it's like a little bit of an opening into the wall of this blastula. Okay, technically animals can this can have one of two possible outcomes. Okay, animals that fall under the category of something called a protostome is an animal whose the blastopore will eventually become the mouth of that animal. Okay, so I know this just looks like a blob of cells and we can't really tell anything, but embryologists dedicate their lives to studying this, and this is kind of just the culmination. This is the short version of it, but by research, lots of research, there are organisms that are grouped together under this category of protostomes. And all that just means is that blastopore becomes the mouth part, the mouth of that organism eventually, once it's fully developed. Okay, now these other terms, ectoderm, mesoderm, endoderm, we're going to talk about those in just a second. So you can label them on your diagram, but you'll have more clarification on what they mean and what they turn into later. Okay, for now, protostomes are the ones whose blastopore becomes a mouth. Okay, and in fact, most invertebrate animals, which are the simpler animals, fall under this group, fall under protostomes. Okay, now the other group are deuterostomes. And deuterostomes form a little bit differently. There's still a blastopore that forms, but they are animals whose the blastopore actually becomes the other end, becomes the anus. And so this tends to be the area, this is where the waste and everything is going to come out of. This is like the end part of the digestive tract. And there's only, and instead of invertebrates, which are protostomes, deuterostomes are actually, there's a couple of them. There are echinoderms, which are like starfish and so on. We're going to talk about them as a separate group, but also chordates or vertebrates fall under this group. Okay. So these two groups of the evolutionary tree are deuterostomes, and so with this information, the study in embryology, this indicates that vertebrates, chordates, possibly have a closer evolutionary relationship to echinoderms than they do to all the other organisms that we, like invertebrates, like mollusks and worms and sponges and cnidarians and things that we're going to learn about earlier on in the next semester. Okay, so I mentioned that there were, in your diagrams, there were some colored regions. And so I kind of want to point to what these things are and explain what they are. So there were endoderm, mesoderm, and ectoderm. And these are just germ layers, okay? I should kind of clarify what germ layers are. Sorry, I just want to make sure. Oh, yeah. So during the early development of, of an embryo, most animal embryos differentiate into these layers. Okay, so these ectoderm, mesoderm, endoderm are the beginning parts of that cell specialization. So some of these cells are going to develop into different parts of the eventual animal once it's matured. Okay, so the first one that I wanted to point was the endoderm. Okay, so this is the innermost layer. We call these layers germ layers. Okay, I know it's germ layer is what they're called. Okay, but the endoderm is the innermost one, and this endoderm eventually develops into the lining of the digestive tract and actually the lining of much of the respiratory system. So lungs or things that are similar to lungs, as well as the digestive system or gastrointestinal tract, that's what the endoderm turns into. Okay, and we can see it colored as yellow here and here. Now, if you have a highlighter, it might actually be easier, might be better for you to go ahead and highlight these. If you don't have a highlighter right now, don't worry about it. You can always refer back to this diagram in your textbook on page 661. Okay, mesoderm is, meso means middle, so this is the middle germ layer, and we kind of see it as red here. So you can see it here and here for this protostome, and then here and here for a deuterostome. The mesoderm actually develops into muscles or whatever is similar to muscle tissue, circulatory system, reproductive system, and all the excretory organ systems. So, for the more complex animals, that would be like kidneys and the urinary system. For simpler animals, they have similar systems, not as complicated as a kidney and as kidneys and excretory systems, but something like it. Okay, so that's what the mesoderm does. Then the ectoderm, or the outermost layer, is what we see in blue, and it makes sense that it's called the ectoderm because it's the outermost layer. Okay, so this develops into what will be sensory organs, so sight, smell, hearing, right? Nerves, which are going to pick up information from the external environment, okay? And then also the outer layer of the skin. Okay, so that's it for cell specialization and levels of organization. Let's move on to body symmetry. Okay, so except for sponges, which are a different group of animal that we're going to look at earlier on next semester, every animal exhibits some kind of body symmetry in its structure. Okay, and so symmetry just means it has to do with like mirror images of different sides of the body. Okay, and we'll talk about if you're in sports med or have taken any of those before, you might have heard of the planes of the body. We're going to kind of go over those a little bit. Okay, so this right here is a sea anemone. It's considered a simple animal. Okay, and simpler animals like the sea anemone have body parts that repeat around some kind of central point in the body. Okay, and so we call this radial symmetry. Okay, so you can see if we were to kind of take an imaginary line and divide the body into two halves, radial symmetry means that we could draw an imaginary line in any direction through the center, and it could basically come up with two halves that are about the same as one another. Okay, so if I were to cut along this line, these two halves, like this half and this half, are still pretty similar to one another. If I were to cut along this line, still pretty similar. If I were to cut along this line, this line, these two sides would be similar. So very similar to like if you were to look at a wheel or a pie or something like that. If you cut it in half, both sides look about the same. And you could do that any number of ways. Okay, however, more complex animals display something called bilateral symmetry. And lateral means side, so bilateral means like two-sided symmetry. And all that means is there's only really one imaginary line that you could draw that's going to make two equal halves, a left half and a right half. Okay, so this crayfish right here is displaying bilateral symmetry. Okay, so you can kind of see if I were to draw an imaginary line this way, yeah, that doesn't really make two equal halves. This end would look very different from this end. However, along this plane of symmetry, the one that you're seeing in the diagram, that does actually make two equal halves. And since that's the only real way that you could go about doing that line of symmetry, we would call this bilateral symmetry. Okay, now in bilateral symmetry animals, so more complex animals, we actually have different terms for different areas, different ends of the body. Okay, so first of all, there's anterior and posterior, and we're going to revisit all of these terms again next semester before we start doing dissections, because these are terms that you're going to need to use for dissections. But anterior just means towards the front of that organism. Posterior means towards the back end. Okay. Now I should specify, and I just realized now I don't have it on here. Anterior is sometimes called cranial, which for obvious reasons it's towards the head, so cranium towards the head. And then posterior is sometimes called caudal, C-A-U-D-A-L. Again, if you don't write it on this slide, don't worry about it. We're going to make sure we go over it next semester. But you may see those terms thrown at you. They mean the same thing as anterior, posterior. Okay, dorsal means the upper side, so towards the back of that organism. So the dorsal side of this crayfish is the surface the surface on top of it. Okay, so like its back, the upper part of its back and its tail. Okay, ventral is the underside. So think of it like the belly. The belly surface of this crayfish would be considered the ventral side. Okay. All right. The third trend is cephalization. So animals with bilateral symmetry, like the crayfish, exhibit something called cephalization, which just means that all the sensory organs and nerve cells tend to be concentrated towards the front end of the body. And this actually makes a lot of sense. If you imagine an animal with bilateral symmetry, I'm going to switch back here for a second. An animal with bilateral symmetry like this is going to, when it moves around, is going to tend to walk towards the anterior, towards the front. Okay, so it makes sense that all the sensory organs are going to be concentrated towards the front end. So in this case, this crayfish has eyes, has antennae that feel like sensation, like touch. Other sensory organs are more concentrated at this end because when this crayfish is walking around, this end is going to encounter a new environment first. Okay, so cephalization tends to happen in those more complex organisms that have this bilateral symmetry. Okay, yeah, I think that's it. Okay. And then lastly, the fourth trend is body cavity formation. Okay, so most animals have a body cavity, which is just this fluid-filled space between the digestive tract, which is like the inner tube running from mouth to anus, and then the body wall. Okay, so like the inside of the inside of this, a body cavity, if you think of like your own body with the digestive system, right? You actually have all of these organs inside of a body cavity inside of your torso, okay? And this body cavity actually has fluid in it as well to kind of keep those organs working properly and so on. In fact, this body cavity provides a place where those internal organs can be suspended, aren't going to get squished by muscles that are contracting around them or twisted out of shape. We have names for these different body cavities. We don't really talk about it so much right now, but we might refer back to them when we'll eventually refer back to them when we get into next semester. But body cavities do allow specialized regions to develop. So they provide room for internal organs. In some cases, there may be like special excretions to help with the body functions taking place inside. But for the most part, body cavity formation is something that you see as organisms get more and more complex. When you look at very simple organisms, they don't really have these body cavities where all of these highly specialized organs can be found. Okay, I think that's actually it. Yes, that is. Okay, thanks.